Everyone. My name is Dr. Paris Woods, and I'm the Chief Program Officer at Strive Together. Strive Together is a national network focused on ensuring every child can succeed from cradle to career. Partnering with nearly 70 communities across the U.S., Strive Together supports local leaders, organizations, and families. We want this session to be as engaging as possible, and we encourage you to ask questions and share your thoughts throughout. There are a few ways you can interact with us during this webinar. If you are joining us via Zoom, you can submit your questions using the Q&A feature. This helps us keep track of your questions and make sure they don't get lost in the chat. You're also welcome to drop comments or questions in the Zoom chat, and we'll do our best to monitor those as well. And for those who are streaming live on YouTube, you can ask questions in the comment section, and our team will pass them along to us here. So we'll dedicate some time to answer your questions during the webinar. Do not hesitate to ask at any point. This afternoon, I am thrilled to welcome one of my favorite scholars, Dr. Manuel Pastor, the director of the Equity Research Institute at the University of Southern California. He's also a distinguished professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity at USC. Dr. Pastor is an expert on the power of place. He has a deep understanding of the impact that zip codes can have on destiny, and his research delves into the economic, environmental, and social conditions. He's not just looking at the data, he is deeply invested in what we can do about it. His most recent book explored the role of movements and how we can build the solidarity we need in our communities to increase economic mobility. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Manuel Pastor.
Thank you, Dr. Woods. Really a pleasure to be with everyone today remotely. I appreciated every part of your introduction. I definitely appreciated being one of your favorite academics, although given the reputation academics have, that might put me in like a very bad crowd, standing out with only mediocre contributions. But anyway, thank you for your kind words. Good to be with you all today, and I'm going to, because I am an academic, bring up a PowerPoint, because we know that there's very few points that can be made without a PowerPoint. Although, of course, we've seen lots of PowerPoints that have no point at all. But I think this one, I hope you'll agree, does have some utility. So let me bring it up and share it. And let me make sure by having Paris nod that you can actually see this. Okay, great. So I am gonna talk to you today from a particular period in our history. I talked, or the title we originally had was Building Equitable Communities in an Era of Change, but I added and uncertainty, because certainly after these last elections, for the moment that we are in the United States, there's a great deal of uncertainty. Uncertainty about how issues of equity will be dealt with in the future. Uncertainty about how we will be speaking about race and racism. Uncertainty in our communities, which have many mixed status families who are frightened about what they think the future portends, and many who are just worried about a return to chaos. And in this moment of what has been a political earthquake, although like many earthquakes, it could have been anticipated if you had your ear to the ground listening to the rumbling. In this era of a political earthquake, it's always good to think about the fault lines that were there before. It's part of what we'll do today. But it's important to understand that this is occurring against the backdrop of a long series of shocks to our economic, social, and political systems. They've been there for a very long time, but just in recent history, I wind up thinking about my kids who are 38 and 35. My 35-year-old daughter is a social worker. Godspeed. My 38-year-old son is a musician. God, please play for his income. So we, uh, I think about what the world has been like as they've grown up. And the 2008, 2009 financial crisis, which permanently scarred a lot of young people as they entered into the labor market. Because if you know the research, when you come into the labor market and it's bad, that puts you on a flatter wage trajectory for the future. But it was also a moment in which our economy had been run into the ground by the masters of finance who claimed that they could make no mistakes. And so there was a great deal of questioning of our economic system, so-called market system, that left lower income people prey to the market, but had our government intervene to save banks. So big questioning of our economic system and of our business elites. The election of Obama, particularly for young people, brought a ray of hope and potentially change. But quickly, within 2 years, the Tea Party backlash, which was a political whiplash moving in a very different direction, emboldening a right with many appeals to fears around the changing demography of the country, which helped lead to the election of Donald Trump in 2016, another big shock to our system, an unanticipated victory, even for that candidate in that year, anyway. It's unanticipated. He looked as surprised when he won as did Hillary when she lost. Uh, we then were beset by the COVID crisis, the largest health emergency in over a century, tremendous loss of life, a period in which the disease revealed our illnesses of a racial wealth gap, economic insecurity, lack of access to healthcare. This brought on a tremendous amount of uncertainty in our system that was again shocked by the murder of George Floyd and the racial reckoning and protests that took place. And then, of course, the backlash to that. And now we're on the eve of a whole new era of policies being upturned, communities feeling threatened and insecure, polarization sharper than ever, difficult for conversations to take place. Having set all that up, I imagine what you're hoping I'll do is to answer it all and provide, optimistic path forward. I don't think so. Uh, what I am going to do instead is lift up some of the underlying issues and then offer some lessons for what we might be thinking about in the years ahead. After the election, I've been talking to students and different audiences and asking three questions. What do you think? What are you feeling? What's your emotion? What are you thinking? But most important, what are you rethinking? What are you giving up about what you believed before in order to move forward? The what are you feeling part, though, is important as well. Many of us, you're probably like me, are the kind of people who go through the stages of grief rather rapidly and try to figure out what it is you need to do for the communities you're working with, for creating dialogue and conversation. It's important for us to realize if we're that kind of person, I know I am, and probably many of you are, that there are others who are just shell shocked by this, who feel despondent rather than determined. Uh, and we need to create space for everyone's feelings, emotions. Some might be gleeful as we go through the next few years. So, what gave rise to this moment? Part of it is the changing demography of the country. Some of these slides will be familiar for people who were with me when I spoke at the Strive Together conference, but in a few minutes you'll see some stuff you definitely did not see there. But the country is on a slow shift to becoming majority non-white. Whether or not it becomes a majority people of color in terms of communities that are non-white, thinking of themselves as one group, definitely is up for question. But that shift to being a majority minority society has created some sense of turmoil and dislocation for many Americans, and that's fed into a nostalgia for an America of the past. And how do we get back to that place that was more ordered? Now, this demographic change, going from about 69% non-Hispanic white in 2000 to about 48% non-Hispanic white in 2050, is basically the demographic change California went through between 1980 and 2000. California, irritating for other states to hear it, was America fast forward. That 20-year period was marked by a lot of turmoil and conflict around issues of immigration, affirmative action, DEI, bilingual education, and other sorts of issues. And in many ways, that was a kind of compressed presaging of what the US is witnessing now. One thing to note that we'll get more to is that that demographic shift has actually slowed dramatically in California. And you'll see in a minute, it's mostly occurring elsewhere. So until at least the last few years, where there really was a surge of migrants at the border in 2022 and 2023, really the big era of mass migration had ceased. If you look at the share of the US that was foreign born between 1990 2008, when Obama was first elected, you could see a fairly sizable increase from about 8% to about 12.5%. But then going from 2008 to 2012, roughly the same period of time, the share of the US that was foreign born only went up by about 1.3%. And while certainly there's been a big number in the last few years of border crossers, particularly seeking asylum, one needs to ask the question, why is it that there's been so much anxiety around immigration when in fact it hasn't been the biggest driver of our demographic change? Part of it is the way in which immigrants have relocated. So in 1990, about a third of all immigrants in the US were living in California. Now that number's about 22, 23%, far less than a quarter. What happened? Well, first, a lot of immigrants who used to come to California, the big first stop, are now going to other states directly. And a lot of immigrants in California are moving to other states, often because of high housing prices in this state and lower housing prices in other states. That's been one part of what has happened geographically. So if we look at the United States in 1980, counties of the United States, the darkest shade indicating that the county was greater than 50% people of color, the lightest, less than 40% people of color, the middle, sort of tan, 40 to 50%, which seems to be a tipping point for neighborhoods and for counties. That in 1980, what you were looking at, smell should work, was sort of the black belt of the South heading up to DC, the Texas borderlands with Mexico, Native American and Hispanic areas of New Mexico and Arizona, Native American areas of the Dakotas. But in California, for example, only one county, Imperial, adjoining Mexico, was a majority people of color in 1980. As we moved to 2000, you could see a lot of that change I talked about occurring in California. As we move to 2020, you'll note that that change is much more widespread. California is certainly a little bit in the Northwest, far more parts of New Mexico. The black belt to the south has become a wider belt, particularly as places like Atlanta have become a mecca for a reverse great migration of Black people moving from the Midwest, the Northeast, to the South. And as you move to the future, you can see that this demographic change is very widespread, including in places people don't think about. More and more of Utah, the Dakotas, other locations, Minnesota. So part of what's gone on is that demography has come or is coming to more destinations. And it is that transformation that gives rise to fear and a sense of change. We all know from the last electoral season how it was that a group of legal Haitian immigrants brought by jobs to Ohio actually became a bit of a punching bag for concerns about demographic change and whether or not distinct cultures are just so different that othering and imagining habits that don't exist can become part of the political discourse. So part of the sense of unease in the country has to do not just with the raw fact of demographic change, but the fact that it's occurring in places that had not experienced it very much before. And so community building becomes more challenging. One way to see this, which to me is very dramatic, this is US, all Latinos in the United States. You could see that in 1990, more than a third, nearly 35% lived in California, 20% in Texas, about 10% in New York. The slice I want to highlight here is the South. The South was only about had hosted only about 3.6% of the nation's Latino or Hispanic population. When we move to the most recent census, the South is host to 10% of the country's Latinos. California now only houses about a quarter. Texas is about the same, but the Latinos in Texas have changed dramatically, far more second generation, often involved in law enforcement, including Border Patrol. So tending to be more conservative, very diverse population. But again, striking that this is being distributed to places like the South where the traditional racial dynamic was black-white and now is made more complex by this arrival of a different group trying to figure out its own identity in America. So, demographic change, it's got a different geography than most people think because we tend to be focused in on the past and think, oh, that all occurred in California. So it'll continue to occur in California instead of seeing that it's changed. It's all over the country. Uh, and not understanding where the growth is coming from, thinking that it must be immigrants, both because that's what drove change in the past and because of the spectacular disorder at the border that reigned for a couple of years. But what's important to note is that what's driving the demographic change is the change in the youth population. This is the youth population, those below the age of 18, between 2000 and 2022. In that 22-year period, the number of young whites fell by about 10 million. This is because more young whites were becoming 18 and 19, graduating, than becoming 0 and 1, entering. The number of young Black people fell by about 1.3 million. The youth growth has come largely from the Latino and AAPI population, creating another dimension of separation or disconnection and polarization, which is a disconnection between who the older generation is and who the next or younger generation is, something that also becomes a challenge for community building, one of the first steps for equitable community building. And this is reflected in the median age. This is showing you that in the United States, the median age, half older, half younger, for white folks is 44. For API, 38, slightly older. It's because it's an overwhelmingly immigrant population. 35 for Black folks, that's the same as it is for Native Americans. 30 for Latinos. So big gap in terms of number of years, big gap between generations. Another element of disconnection, of challenge around what community building needs to look like, but also how we scale from local community building to community building that crosses groups, crosses geographies, and crosses generations. All of this demographic change has occurred against a backdrop of real economic anxiety. And that anxiety comes from several different places. First, the growing income inequality in the United States. Here, the line to follow best is the blue line. That's the share of national income going to the top 1%. And you could see that in the early 20th century is quite high, basically suppressed by the Great Depression and the belt tightening and national spirit, really, of World War II. Then in the post-war period, you had fairly stable share of national income going to the top 1% at around 10% of national income. Bit of a dip during the 70s, but fairly stable period. But since 1980, the share of income going to the top 1% has steadily gone up, such that while in around the early 1980s was around 10% of all the nation's income going to the top 1%, now it's more than a quarter. So there's a sense of the 1% running away from the rest of us in ways that create another level of disconnection, something seen even in recent weeks in which the celebration of online quite frightening of someone who shot and killed the CEO of a health company. You have to ask yourself, since that CEO is a human being and any loss of life is a tragedy and our heart should go out, why is it that so many were not having that as their initial reaction? And part of it is the way in which the 1% have run away from the rest, and it's felt like things are rigged. That is disconnect uh, is got several different elements to it. Uh, one is broad questions of class. Another is sort of differences within those who work. And then the third has to do with race. So let's start with the first. This is a graph that's a little hard to follow. But if you've been listening to me, you know that I love graphs. And I don't think any graph is hard to follow. Uh, so what this shows you, it's the ratio of compensation to productivity. So the way to think about it is if a worker gets more productive, does their pay go up along with their productivity? And if their pay goes up along with their productivity, that means a couple things. Uh, it means that probably the labor share of income is staying the same, the corporate share of income is staying the same, but also workers see themselves in the companies that they work for because they feel that, well, if the company gets more productive, I put in my effort and I'm getting a reward. And in the post-war period, we had growth in productivity that was matched by growth in pay. As you move to the 1960s, you begin to see so that means that the ratio of compensation and productivity is about the same. As you move to the 1960s, start to face a little bit more international competition. You could see how the ratio of compensation and productivity is going down. But then from about 1980 on, it's a much steeper decline. And so there's a sense amongst people who work, which is not misplaced, that when the harder they work, does not necessarily mean that their incomes go up. Source of tension. Another source of tension. This is looking at full-time year-round workers for the United States and California. I introduced California for two reasons. One is I'm from California, so why not? But also because, again, California, America, fast forward. What you can see here is that over the period 1980 to 2021, full-time year-round worker, if you're at the 90th percentile, your income went up, even more so in California. 90th percentile means 10% make more, 90% less. 80th percentile, your income went up. The median, you flatlined. At the bottom, your income fell. And this is for full-time year-round workers. So what does this mean? This means, and you heard it politically in this last election, that those of us who are professionals, more educated, already making more money, have been more shielded and have been beneficiaries of the movement to an economy that rewards degrees and not just hard work. And that those without degrees or connections have seen their incomes fall. So for those of us who've done well, inflation is bothersome, but it's not life-shattering as it is for those who've not only seen wages not rise with productivity on average, but have seen their wages actually fall in real terms. This has a racial dimension to it. This is median household income. Again, median is the household, in this case, in the middle. Doing LA County, because it's a place where this is somewhat dramatic, where you could see non-Hispanic household income towering over Black and Latino household income, AAPI, not too far behind. But what's fascinating is when you look at not just median household income, but what that looks like for households raising small children, children 5 and under. Watch what happens. The gaps sharply increase. And so we're in a situation in which we've got inequality baking into the next generation by virtue of the kind of households and the income level kids are growing up in. It'd be lovely if that was all due to education. But what this chart shows you is that as you move from left to right, from less than a high school diploma to a BA or better, that wages rise. But that in each and every level of education, Black workers, Latino workers pay a wage penalty. And the wage penalty for Asian workers actually only gets eliminated, in fact, superseded, when we move to BA or higher. So this is a chart on wealth. No surprise, white wealth towers Black wealth. And so while incomes are disparate, the cushions that people have to weather an emergency are even more disparate. So these are all the fault lines that have contributed to demographic anxiety, economic uncertainty, depths of concern about the future, and the need to rethink and come up with a way that can actually build and scale community. So, what do I think is needed? I think the first thing that's needed is a new economic narrative. And we actually tried to do this in a book, came out a few years ago. Maybe it should have been read more, called solidarity economics, why mutuality and movements matter. This is a book that is available for free as a download on a website called solidarityeconomics.org, solidarityeconomics.org. It's also on that website available in a comic book version, which is in both English and in Spanish, and has been used for more popular education because, as wonderful as it is to bring you all up to speed, it's much better to figure out how we bring our communities up to speed. So, what do we say in that book about the narrative? The first is that we should always talk about our economy and not the economy. When we use the word the economy, makes it sound like something out there that is given to us by God, nature, or the market, and that cannot be changed. When in fact, there must be a reason why in the post-war period, when productivity rose, wages rose. There must be a reason why inequality has gotten so much sharper. There must be a reason why the racial wealth gap is so persistent, and it has to do with the way we organize our economy and how we might organize it in a different way. And when we say our economy, it creates more of a sense of our ownership together around the rules and our needs to contribute to our economy as well. When we think about that, we begin to understand that we need a different view of what economists call economic man. They really were that sexist to say that. And to think about people as not just being self-interested, but also how it is that we are other or community interested and what we need to do to be able to uh, encourage our mutuality. This is important because I believe that in the US, our traditional debate ideologically about economic policy is whether or not we have the market do it or whether or not we have the government do it, when in fact, many of the problems we've got would be better handled by us. Certainly, the government plays a role. The market can allocate resources in ways that are sometimes unfair, but sometimes efficient. But what is the role of the nonprofit sector? What is the role of community? And we need to open up our economic thinking to that. We also need to understand that the current level of inequality has been associated with not economic prosperity, but economic downfall. If you go back and look at those charts about when inequality was rising, wasn't exactly a great time for most of us anyway. And in a research project we did for an earlier book, Equity, Growth, and Community, we looked at 200 metropolitan regions in the United States and asked the question, what allows them to sustain employment growth over time and what derails sustained growth. And the single largest factor that derailed sustained growth was income inequality. Racial segregation played a role, and metropolitan government fragmentation, which means just when you've got a lot of governments in a particular metro region, which make it hard to agree on or coordinate on an economic or social policy. Now, you might look at that research and say, I'm not sure I believe it. This is an economist from California. Surely they come up with their ideas in hot tubs. Um, can we really trust them? But this kind of work has been echoed and foreshadowed by the Federal Reserve, the International Monetary Fund, and a wide range of economists. But finally, and this gets a little bit to the question of community building, is that what is it that prevents us from seeing our economy? Instead, thinks of it as individuals in a market. What is it that prevents us from seeing that something we fundamentally know? When you care for others, businesses do better, communities do better. Is a profound sense of disconnection. If we were not this disconnected, we would not be as fearful of demographic change or of new immigrants. If we were not this disconnected, we would find it intolerable that people who seem like they're people like us are living unhoused on the street. If we were not this disconnected from ourselves and Mother Earth, we'd be appalled and activated by the climate crisis and what we need to do. So we really need to deal with the issues of disconnection. And in this book I mentioned, Equity, Growth, and Community, we tried to look at what metropolitan areas were able to do a better job on both prosperity and inclusion. And we found out that the weird secret was not just economic policy, but whether or not they'd been able to create diverse and dynamic epistemic communities. Fancy words. Let me break it down. Community is who you know. I'm sorry, epistemic is what you know. Community is who you know it with. Diverse means multiple sectors, multiple races, multiple communities. Dynamic means you can change with the times. And we found that the regions that did best basically had bought into the new three R's: roots, relationships, and reason. They'd created a common sense of regional, commonly held sense of regional destiny that we will only do as well as our region does. They had built relationships between diverse actors over time. And they had created data-driven platforms to be able to measure inequality, to ground everybody's conversation in the same set of realities so that they could reason together. And this part of the reason why I showed you a bunch of charts right at the beginning. How do we ground ourselves in data and begin to see the parameters of the crises we face and the opportunities that might be there? And also begin to understand that while the favorite expression in the United States is that his talk is cheap, And I appreciate that because what we mean by that is you got to do stuff, not just talk about it. But talk is not cheap. It requires effort and it can change hearts and minds in ways that encourage collaboration rather than zero sum competition. So, first big point, we need a new economic narrative, and it's deeply connected to reconnecting. Second, we need a new take on race and identity. There's some who do not want to recognize the disparities that are so obvious in the data. There are others that make the disparities and the history the object of so much attention and conversation that others tire of being in that conversation. How do we get out of this box? I think we need to be data oriented. I think we need to be forward looking. Obviously, there's a legacy of the past, but forward looking brings more people into a conversation. We need to recognize our own multiple selves. Whatever ethnicity you are, you're a lot of things. I'm Latino. I'm working class. I'm a professor. I'm the father of a musician. I live in Los Angeles. Uh, I have spent a lot of time in South LA, which leads me to a deep appreciation of work in Black communities. I'm a Kendrick Lamar fan, and I'm somewhat surprised I have not quoted him yet in this conversation. I hope to get to it. Uh, so I'm deep in the tracks. Um, so recognizing our multiple selves instead of reducing ourselves to one facet of identity, continuing to have face-to-face conversations, which I think makes it more difficult to separate people by race, and to think about identity as a way of finding our path to common ground. We need to stress interdependence. These two charts, one shows you employment in California. The blue line at the bottom is what you might think would be the big job creator, high tech. But you can see that it's actually dwarfed by size and growth by nursing, elder, family, home health, and childcare services. And those two part of the economy, of our economy, are connected. If we're going to have high tech, we got a lot of programmers who have nannies and gardeners and food service workers. And all of that goes together, recognizing our interdependence. And the chart on the right, which is animated and therefore cool, points out, without going into details, simply that we who are older depend on those who are younger to support not just Social Security and Medicare, but our entire economy. And yet, too often, the older pitted against the young. We will protect Social Security, but we will cut education spending. But you're not going to have education spending, a bit Social Security in the future, unless we double down now on making our next generation, often Black and brown, often low income, more educated, more productive. What we also need is a new accountability. People do not have faith in government and in other institutions because there's not a sense of them delivering. I've said recently about California, we're really good at innovating, high tech, new social policy. We're really good at including, uh, great at thinking about racial disparities, welcoming of LGBTQ. We're very bad at implementing and getting stuff done. Because if you really want low-income communities to thrive, we need affordable housing, and that means building. If you really want prisons to shrink, you need world-class reentry programs. We need to be thinking about accountability to restore faith in our institutions and to implement change. Finally, we need to be thinking about a new localism. This includes community wealth building through co-ops, community land trusts, and what are called anchor institutions. I'm sure some of you are part of this, where educational institutions, health institutions can help subcontract with local suppliers and develop local economies. We need to understand that an economic message that lifts up equity is not an anti-business message, but it's an invitation to support high road businesses that reinvest in communities. That we can get there through community benefits agreements. We can get there through government policy. We can get there through our own consumer patterns and whether or not we ask questions about the products we buy and the companies we utilize to see whether or not they live up to our highest standards. But we also need to understand that localism is not about retreating to a small scale because it's more manageable, but trying to figure out how to make things work at a smaller scale so we can begin to build upwards to metro areas, to states, and the nation, because we really cannot live with this level of disconnection and polarization and be successful. So, last thoughts. Skip the first one. We can get to it in Q&A. And just do number 2 and number 3 and 4. So I think understanding that, again, this metaphor, what seems like a political earthquake, is because there were longstanding fault lines. And we are in the midst of fundamental transformation. What's at stake is everything. And what we do in the next few years, the next decade, will reshape the future in fundamental ways. Because of that, it's time not to linger on our favorite issue, but to figure out how to offer a broad vision. Not to try to make a quick conversion of someone to your way of thinking, but to engage in a long conversation to understand what all of our communities are thinking and how we can bridge these divides. And in the next few years, to protect communities at risk, to understand what I was saying about scale from local to city, metro, state, and most significantly, to be open to rethinking. I was at a conference at the beginning of this week. Some of this happened, some of it didn't. But at one point, I was really frustrated because I was asking myself, what are our speakers at this conference saying that they would not have said 2 years ago? And that's what I want to hear. What's new? What got shook up for you? What's shifting in your perspective? So that's what I wanted to offer for today. If you're interested in more, uh, the story of California is told in the book State of Resistance. Much of what I talked about today is in Solidarity Economics. Our newest book is the book on the left, Charging Forward. It's a really good book. Very well written. It's very exciting. And we're making 2 documentaries alongside of it. So really cool. Pick it up. Makes great holiday gifts. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Pastor, for that meaningful presentation. I know many of the folks in the audience are eager to dive deeper into these ideas and ask their own questions. So just a quick reminder, there are several ways you can join the conversation and ask questions. If you're here on Zoom, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. This helps us keep track of your questions and ensure that they get addressed. You're also welcome to drop your questions in the Zoom chat if that's easier for you. Just make sure to label them as questions so they don't get lost in the discussion. And Dr. Pastor, there's a really lovely message from Angel Lozano in the chat if you get a chance. He had to step out. And then for those of you who are watching on YouTube, you can post your questions in the comments section and our team will pass them along to me here. So feel free to start submitting your questions now and we'll answer as many as we can during this Q&A session. So with that, let's dive into the first question. Came in from Alejandro Perez, who asked, what does Dr. Pastor make of conservative voting patterns among Latinos that may hurt their own communities?
So I think I would say is first, we should approach any of these questions with curiosity. And the voting patterns might, certainly in our view and in mine, hurt communities. But then we need to ask the question, why was it not seen that way by people in that community? And so I think with reference to the last election, a couple things. First is there really was a big shift within the Latino population. So prior years, it's been pretty easy because exit polls are kind of unreliable and they do a bad job, in particular with Latino voters. They kind of got over the years good at white and black voters, but Latinos are a newer element. But this move has been so dramatic that there's something there. I think in this last election, there were uh, definitely patterns of anti-blackness within the Latino community. This is something that immigrants bring from home countries. Arriving in the United States is not destined to beat the anti-blackness out of you. It's a thing that's reinforced by our racial structures. Uh, there's certainly sexism, uh, which affected the Democratic candidate. Again, difficult to talk about, but it was certainly there when I go out and talk to people who are in the community. And I think for those of us who are, so for me, and given the fact that I've got an executive management team that's 3 strong women, uh, and that I work with a lot of extraordinarily smart and capable women, the inability of some people to see a woman, particularly a woman of Harris's caliber and intelligence, being president was almost unfathomable, but that's there. I do think that uh, once you acknowledge that anti-blackness and sexism, that it's a little bit like saying there's smog in Los Angeles. Um, it's like, yeah, that's there. So what else, right? Where would the breakthrough happen? And I think that the there were a couple of things that I think are really important. First, I was hearing this for a couple of years. At first, it kind of surprised me. I was hearing long-term immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, saying, man, that's a lot of people at the border. And why are they getting assistance so quickly when I didn't get any help at all? So there was resentment. Uh, Second, I feel like the Latino community in particular is a very working class community. It's defined, I mean, by profession, by occupation, by income. And we forget that class is culture, like being Latino's culture, but class is culture too. Um, I am an academic now, but when I grew up, I felt like a lot of my culture was like being a construction worker, being able to fix cars, working with your hands, solidarity. And that a lot of that was class.
Mm.
Um, and I feel like the message we had, uh, progressives often have a message of, there's enough wealth to go around. But I think the message for Latino working class is there's enough work to go around. Like there's enough to do, to contribute to, and to earn. Uh, but when you say there's enough wealth to go around, there's like, wait a minute, somebody going to give me something might be taken away versus work. Um, so I think those are important factors. Another factor which people don't like to talk about, but what the heck, rethinking requires us to talk about, is that police and law enforcement, military is a bit of an exception to this, um, have done a really bad job about bringing Black people in, but they've done a better job with Latinos. The military's done a pretty good job with both Black and Latino populations, but law enforcement. And so I think there's a much bigger, like in many places like LA, the percent of officers who are Latino is similar to the population. And so there's a mode around law enforcement and security that has more appeal than progressives can speak to. And I think we also forget, in speaking about that, that if you're working class, you're walking over to the CVS for razor blades and shampoo, and everything's locked up. If you're professional middle class, you get frustrated and you order it all on Amazon to be delivered. So you never think for a minute, I wonder if we need more safety.
Mm.
So I feel like those are the things that respond to the particular question that was asked. There were many other things I think going on this election, not just for Latinos, but for other groups. But that's been one of the most traumatic political swings.
Really helpful. And I would say, folks, feel free to, if things are resonating with you, use the chat. Feel free to sort of talk back with us. I know we're on Spotlight, but we want to include you. We'll move to the next question from Olivia Johnson, who asked, are there any good resources for anyone who has found, are there any good resources anyone has found that help explain income and wealth inequality over time, cross-referenced with changes in taxes?
Yes, unfortunately, a lot of this is not as accessible as it might be. Um, the people who've done the best job of explaining this are Thomas Piketty, who wrote that book, Capital, became quite famous. Everybody bought it. They wrote 4 pages and couldn't read it. We're getting, by the way, a good asset that's actually also put in um, the chat by Janisha. And prior to that book, Janisha, Black Wealth, White Wealth, by Melvin Oliver, which I think is quite good as well. So I think there's uh, that. I think the specific thing with taxes is kind of interesting. It's not what most people think. Most people think that because taxes were cut for the wealthy, that that's the source of the growing disparity. It's like the after-tax gains. But actually, the gains are pre-tax. Because what happened was it used to be that the highest marginal tax rate, the tax rate you experience at higher and higher levels of income, was so high that the heads of C companies were more likely to say, give me some stock. And I'm invested in the long-term health of this company because that's how I'll make my money in the long run. And with the sharp decline in high marginal tax rates on extra income, very high levels of income, it became much more, you could keep a lot more of it. And so people began chasing higher CEO pay. And of course, who's on the board are other CEOs who are like, yeah, sure, you're worth it. Um, then we had a lot of financial liberalization. So a lot of money to be made in finances. And I think that's really the way taxes played in. It's not, that shift is not about after tax. That shift is the way it changed the structure of incentives.
Mhm.
Prior, particularly to Ronald Reagan's adventures in tax cutting, um, you, as a CEO, you might as well take most of your compensation in stock because the taxes were going to be too much on the extra income.
Makes a lot of sense. Um, and also sort of points out how responsive the wealthy can be to changes. And so, quite interesting what changes might actually have the effects that folks are curious about and sort of interested in with these questions. Shelley Hamilton asks, what prevents us from making and owning the market and the government as us?
Such good questions. Um, so the I do think that in many ways it's our limited imagination. So I'll give you an example, uh, very vibrant and current, uh, which is Elon Musk, who is celebrated as a genius um, and tremendous entrepreneur, uh, whose main real claim to fame is Tesla, which was put in place by mandates for clean energy vehicles, and who the company for the longest period of time made no profits except for the fact that it was selling clean air credits to other companies that didn't want to make clean air vehicles. And they still have subsidies in the order of $2 billion a year. Um, Elon Musk, self-made man, was made by public policy. Think of my Apple phone. By the way, those are my two kids. Um, and we think of Steve Jobs and what a genius he was. He was. Half of the patents in this phone were generated by your tax dollars on basic research and development. You don't get a return, but you helped invent this. So I think it's partly that we need a big mind shift to understand how it is that we're all helping to create wealth. I think that the government can be an instrument of us, which is the second part of Shelley's question. But I also think that if you go to Black and Latino communities, the level of trust for the government is low. It's part of the reason why during COVID, when the disparities were noticed, particularly for Black communities, and the government showed up like, we're here with the shots, we're starting with you. People are like, well, the last time you just started with us, that didn't work out so well. So high levels of distrust. For the Latino community, distrust around immigration enforcement and other things. So I think, it's a tall order to assume that the government will be seen as us. It's something that we need to work toward. And that's why I insisted on implementation. Things are implemented and implemented fairly, then people will begin to see the government as a tool of us.
Thank you. Next, we've got a question from Janisha Graham. And she says, Dr. Pastor, I agree that a lot of the problems can be solved by the nonprofit sector. However, if we are being honest, the nonprofit sector is a part of the system competing for government and donor money, and in efforts to do so, oftentimes excludes the people in the community who need the help the most. My question is, how does one ensure that their efforts are actually impacting those who need it the most instead of promoting the latest buzzwords around charity, equity, etc.?
Janisha, you are one smart cookie. Um, so I think that's the constant tension is how we often talk, and I think I presented this at this drive together, what we call a power flower, in which at the center of the flower is community, community organizing, and base building, and that the petals around the flower are parts of the infrastructure that help support that. Research, what I do, advocacy, service delivery, um, legal, uh, communications narrative, etc. And we've tried to, for years, insist that foundations have made a big mistake by investing in all the petals rather than the heart of the flower. To use Janisha's frame, all of the nonprofit servers rather than the community base. The second part, though, is how do we create systems of accountability? Because you do need the nonprofits, you do need the researchers, legal, advocacy, capacity building. How do you create lines of ownership and authority? I think that's partly through, I'm just going to focus on how to make the petals smarter. Um, how we do our professional training so that people get more experience working with community in authentic and partnered ways. I think it's partly by thinking about how you reverse lines of authority. So it's not every grant, but some of our grants, the prime fiscal is a community group, and we are the subs for the research, even though the original request by a foundation or an agency was to work through the university and sub to the community, if that makes sense. So can't do that all the time, but when can things change? Uh, what kind of community advisory boards do you have? What kind of authority do they have about setting direction. But I think this is oh, and then finally, what capacity building are you doing with community so the community is not reliant on you as their capacity? The way we've been thinking about this, which works for part of what you all work on, is we work with a lot of community-based groups that are trying to shift local economic policy in a more equitable or just direction. And that actually requires two things. One is expertise around power building, how to force your way onto a table and get people to listen to you. And then the second is knowing how economic development works. So you can insist on things that might pencil out, that are the pressure points for developers, etc. And that requires some economic expertise. And we're trying to help with training on both sets of skills, power building and economic expertise, so that the capacity is there.
Thank you. I think I might have frozen there, but I'm back. Let's jump to Kurt Madden's question. He says, can you talk a little bit about some of the differences between wealth building and poverty reduction?
I mean, the easiest way to think about it is stock versus flow. You can reduce poverty with guaranteed income programs, which I like. Um, I think they ought to be coupled with job guarantees so that people can find not just support, but place to contribute and have meaning. Um, and you can have meaning aside from working, but it's a big part of how people define themselves. And uh, but wealth building is about having some walkaway money. There's another term for that. Um, but having some money where if an employer treats you badly, you can walk away. Um, if you don't like uh, the way your educational institution is working with you or your kids, you can walk away, or you can walk into organizing about it. And so I think that's about building the nest egg or cushion that, helps people in an emergency, but it just gives them more walkaway. One of the interesting findings from the guaranteed income experiments is people who are conservative worried that the money was going to go on frivolous things. And then the defenders of the program said no, but I think anticipated it would go to food, housing, etc. A remarkable share of guaranteed income is saved because people realize they need to have that first and security deposit so they can walk away from a bad landlord. They need the money if their kid needs it to participate in an extracurricular activity or a cool field trip that will build their capabilities for the future. They want that cushion. And I think that speaks to people need assistance with financial literacy, but people have an instinct that the difference between you and the wealthy is not their spending for their Lamborghini, but their unassailability because they have wealth to protect themselves. And protection is a basic instinct. So I hope that answered that question.
Think so. I'm glad you talked about the walkaway money. So folks can find
I'm
it.
glad I found a different term for it.
I might start using that myself. I think we've got time for one or two more. See what we can do. So Maria Dolores Rodriguez asks, do you see a place for co-ops in the effort to build more equitable communities?
Very much so. Um, Worker co-ops, um, obviously also residential co-ops are another way to go. A lot of these forms have problems obtaining credit and financing because it's so much easier for financial agents and institutions to deal with single owners than with multiple owners. So I think there's also space for those of you interested in policy activism to open up the space to create more opportunities for financial support, loans, credit, etc. for co-ops. There's also consumer co-ops as well.
Thank you. Last question from Sarah Sebastian. Are the demographics in the graphs inclusive of mixed status immigrants? How do you gather demographics of immigrants who come into the US through different paths beside the legal routes?
So we actually have quite a bit on that. And if you are interested, and I'll explain a little bit about it in a minute, there's something called a California Immigrant Data Portal. California Immigrant Data Portal. I think it's immigrantdataca.org is the website. And you'll find that we actually have quite detailed estimates of undocumented folks and mixed status families. And we use them frequently to try to help people understand the ubiquity of this. For example, in LA County, where I live, about 18% of the entire county population is either undocumented themselves or living with an undocumented family member. And in fact, the number of US citizen family members and green card holder family members is bigger than the number of undocumented. So big mixed status families. Now, in order to get these numbers right, we actually, and it's explained on the website, have a lot of methodology that we go through to develop our estimates. And you might ask, since we have to develop them nationally, why do we just release them for California? Because we don't trust another state and what they would do with that data. Versus we feel like, to a large extent, the political battle has been won in California, that this data should be used for investment and not for interrogation. We have worked with other places in different ways, either who are ready for protection, or, for example, I was just in Houston. We did a lot of work with the Houston Endowment on who's eligible to naturalize, who can't, who has not yet naturalized. If you think long and hard enough about that, that means we need to know who simply can't naturalize because they're undocumented. So we've got those estimates for Houston. But what we focus in on is who's eligible to naturalize. So here, who's here legally? has been here for more than 5 years, or 3 years married to a U.S. citizen, but has not yet naturalized, or the obstacles they face: economic, fear, networks, where do they live, where would you deliver services? So there's ways to use this.
Thank you.
But thank you for having me today, and I hope this was a contribution in some way to the work that all of you are doing to bring justice and community to places all over the United States.
Thank you. Like, I always learn so much every time I hear you speak. So I'm so grateful for your time with us today. And thank all of you who joined us and being part of this rich and meaningful conversation. A special thank you to Dr. Pastor for sharing your insights and expertise. We're so grateful for the thoughtful questions and engagement from everyone here. Really made the session the Q&A. Whether you joined us on Zoom or streamed live on YouTube, your participation is what makes these discussions so impactful. Dr. Pastor spoke about the importance of capacity building and making the petals stronger. We want to remind you that registration is open for our 2025 Training Hub offerings. The Training Hub provides high-quality, on-demand learning opportunities that build skills in collaboration, equity, and systems change, empowering you to create lasting impact in your community. Please visit the Training Hub to learn more. The link is in the chat. And currently, all of these courses are available free of charge. So definitely click in and get the courses that you need. Thank you again for spending your time with us. We would love your feedback on this workshop. Please complete the brief survey linked in the chat. We hope you leave today feeling inspired and energized, and we wish you a wonderful rest of your day and hope to see you at our next event. Dr. Pastor, thank you once again, and goodbye.